Can it says it very loudly. Can can someone just confirm if you can see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you ever so much. Cool. So this is a session on motions about democracy and politics. We're also going to spend a chunk of this session talking about UK politics, just because, well, firstly, Path asked me to, and secondly, because as we move towards the general election, that is something that may be relevant for us. Or have I frozen? No, I haven't. Sorry. Cool. That may be something that's relevant for us moving forward in what is a year full of elections across the globe that are really, really important. A year full of questions about politics and democracy and the future of both of those things. We've already had really important elections in India, in South Africa, in Mexico, and obviously the UK and France at the minute, and then followed up with America. There are a number of other countries that will also be having elections that I have not mentioned in that little spiel. I will flag, I love democracy motions, and I think they are, along with politics motions, sort of the OG version of debating, and like at its absolute purest and at its core, debating is about a lot of these issues. And a lot of these issues aren't just things that you can use in debates purely about democracy and purely about politics, but things that you can crowbar to add depth or tactically move debates on in other topics as well. And I will mention a couple of those as I go through. So we will chat about different types of motions. We will chat about common pitfalls that people find in these motions, and we'll chat about some strategies for these motions before we chat about sort of the current UK political system. I will flag a couple of things at the start of this. Firstly, these are mostly my thoughts on democracy and politics motions. That is potentially remarkably uninteresting for any of you. So if you do have thoughts about different things that you come up against as problems, different strategies that you find to be really successful, or different kinds of motions that you face that you don't think I'm covering, please do put something in the chat. Please do raise your hand. Please do shout and interrupt me and say, Jack, you're talking absolute nonsense. Why on earth am I spending my time listening to this when I could be doing literally anything else? Feel free to really engage with this and let me know more about sort of your experiences. And if there are particular things that you would like to get answers to, I'll have regular rough pauses for any questions, but please do feel free to interrupt. This, I'm hoping, is going to be fairly casual and more of an interactive chat about some of this with some sort of discussion points rather than sort of me just chatting about my thoughts. Although maybe that's what people want. I just don't really think that that's what people want. So we will start with different types of motions, and we will start with motions that are largely about democracy, largely about how we have different or approach different kinds of democratic systems. And in my mind, these largely fall into three buckets. As mentioned, there are different sort of buckets than these three, and you might have come across them, but I think these are often three of the more common ones. The first of these is about voting reform. Should we do different things and allow people to vote in different ways in order to get a better system or better outcomes or whatever it is that we might want? Whether the UK should implement proportional representation over first past the post, whether we should only allow certain groups of people to vote on issues if those issues only really relate to them, and sort of things that we can do to make voting better. Do we have blind voting like we had at the original Zagreb Euros? Or I don't think it even was. It might even have been the second one, 2014 Zagreb Euros. Or do we, do other things like have negative votes and various different kinds of voting reform? There is a second sort of batch, which is similar but different in that it's not about how people cast their votes. It's not about who is allowed to access democracy, but instead about how do we restrict campaigning or change the process by which democracy happens. So should manifestos be approved as fully costed by an independent body, or somebody checks whether we should lie, whether they're lying about things, or we score them against their manifestos in their next elections. Whether we should ban external political donations, a fairly common one. Lots of stuff at the minute, particularly about political debates and whether those are a good thing. Those things I sort of think about as the process of democracy. Do they restrict people's ability to engage with the democratic system? Do they allow for undue levels of coercion? What choices are people allowed to make, or of the public sort of taught to make, depending on what it is that they are given at a particular election? And then the last sort of bucket on democracy motions, although as I'll come on to on politics motions, there's a couple that overlap. It's sort of like the theology or the structures of democracy in different countries, sort of more broadly, whether you should have monarchies or not, whether benevolent dictators are better than democracies, whether, I think it was Vienna at the weekend had something about in times of hardship preferring to live in an autocracy than a democracy, and whether or not we support revolutions and into new and different ways of governing places more broadly. I think at the core of all of these debates, and at the core of all democracy debates fundamentally, is how do we take a step back and design a good structure for sort of governance and government? And that can mean a million and one different things. It, in my mind, means it's why democracy debates are often very deep and engaging, and often debates that lend themselves to being particularly accessible to lots of people, because we all, aside from insert meme, living in a society, many of us also live in a democracy and live in systems where we all interact with this on a regular basis. But that touches all of our lives and touches every decision that is made, that is therefore quite impactful, as well as being sort of reaching out into every facet of civil society, which lends itself, I think, quite well to depth. So I think, and we'll come on to this a little bit more later on, but when we're approaching debates about democracies, I think it's useful to think about it from a general stance of what is a good structure for governance and for government. And that can mean lots of different things. And I think having lots of stock, I think democracy debates often lend themselves to having quite good stock around what makes good government and what makes maybe for weaker governments or weaker arguments within debates about democracy. I flag here, I also think lots of these things can be crowed into other debates as well. In particular, debates about media and how we access the news, how we are able to access and be informed about our preferences as voting agents, or voters in less debate jargon words, in democracies. I think there are lots of places where you can move class, or you can insert democracy related arguments into the debate in order to strategically advantage or benefit your side. There are also a bunch of motions that I think are less about democracies and more about politics, and I think there is a very sort of a more contemporary and specific definition that politics is a sort of subset of democratic debates, but sort of about whether political parties, political actors, whether we think that geopolitics and the idea of super states or states becoming more independent and shut off from the world is a good idea. I'm keen here in particular to delineate between political parties and political actors, because I do think, and we'll come on to some of my qualms about how people tend to approach these debates in a bit, but I think that there is often quite a big difference between the two, and I think teams often conflate the two things. I think that parties often, in many countries, political parties are things that have existed for years and years and years, and they're going to exist long beyond their current leaders. And I think we can sometimes frame them as being very short-termist in their interests and wanting to win. But actually, political parties in themselves often have lots of structures and factions within them that help ensure that that political party lasts for a long period of time. The Republican Party will last after Donald Trump. The Conservative Party in the UK will probably last after Rishi Sunak. And I think that that when we think about actually the interests of these parties, sometimes we can be a bit more nuanced on those. Whereas individuals, by comparison, can be a bit more egoistic, sometimes do have sort of short-term interests at heart, but also they are individual people. They're not always super tribalistic about the parties that they're a part of, but they are sort of people with morals and principles of their own, and feelings of their own that may be useful to discuss. The last type of motions in political motions that comes up quite a lot are ones about super states or ones about independence. So whether we regret the expansion of the EU, whether we support the breakup of the world's largest nations, as was at Vienna IV last, the last in-person Vienna IV, and this house, the general sort of, this house believes that some countries should form some union and give it some supranational powers. This is normally things like currency unions. There's been lots of discussions about different things related to Mercosur in different contexts, particularly since the election of Milei in Argentina. I think sometimes we get very caught up in whether these debates, particularly if we're talking about currency unions, as has come up in a few different forums, we think of this as purely an economics debate or purely a debate about whatever it is we're forming a union over. Those are also political debates. There are often lots and lots of political tensions and things underlying a lot of those. So I just wanted to go through those just as a bit of a frame of the kind of motions I think we're talking about. That might not be all the motions, but I think it's a good chunk of them. I now want to chat a little bit about some of the common pitfalls that we often find in democratic and political motions. So we'll start off with democracy debates. And I think the two things that I'm generally going to have here is the too long don't read version of these next two slides. One is pitfalls about democracy debates, one is pitfalls about political debates, is around being too focused on outcomes rather than being focused on sort of principles, basically, or values of different systems, are problems and problematic ways of approaching this debate. And secondly, being very, very unnuanced about who it is that we are talking about as our political actors, if we're talking about political debates. There are some other things as well within this that I will also flag, but I do want to just note that that's sort of general pitfalls that I think people fall into. So what do I mean when I'm talking about outcome bias? I've got a few examples here. So the policy or change to democracy that we're talking about is good because it will lead to individual outcomes that I think are good. So less populism or more progressive governments. The second sort of outcome that we might look at is it prevents people voting for dumb reasons that I don't like. And the third is the thing that makes democracy good is that it leads to a particular good outcome. That might be the enshrinement of human rights. That might be that it leads to less wars and conflicts. That might be that it leads to greater economic growth. And that those things are good things as a result of democracy, and that's why we support them. I think there are a few issues with these sorts of approaches to these rounds. The first is that I think that often these things aren't true, and that often these things are, even if they're true for a very specific view of the debate, particularly if we're talking about this policy will lead to sort of less populism. And your problem is that there are lots of right-wing populists, but actually you're quite happy with left-wing populists. Your issue isn't about populism, your issue is about one side of the debate. And often that means that the claims that you're advancing are symmetrically harmed on both sides if you're trying to reduce the level of populism. I also think that often, if we're talking about changes that prevent people from voting for bad reasons, so particularly if we think they're being lied to about the costings of manifestos or things like that, we often think about the reasons that people vote as sort of being sort of like there is one reason that leads to them to do this, and if we fix this one reason, they won't do it. Whereas actually there are lots of other factors into why it is that people vote. And I think these are often quite easily defeatable arguments. But I think that the main issue with the outcome approach is that if we think the core of democracy debates tends to be about how do we design a system that is generally good, that people can access, that people feel represented by, then whether or not it leads to a good outcome in and of itself isn't always the most helpful approach in getting to democratic outcome in talking about democracies. The last thing I do just want to say actually on this is I think that lots of the times non-democratic states also have and lead to some of the benefits and outcomes that we might want to talk about. There are lots of non-democratic states that have quite good economic growth. There are lots of non-democratic states that don't tend to get into conflict very often, and a lot of that is because it is not because of the democraticness or otherwise of a country. And as a result, the sort of things that we're discussing in these debates tend not to be unique to either side. So a lot of the time, a lot of the outcomes that you can focus on can be fairly easily moved away. And whilst those might be natural to lean to, and it might be natural to think to yourself, well, we should do these things because they have this, it will lead to this impact that I can easily trade off against other teams. Those impacts are often not things that you can prove very effectively. And it is much easier, I think, in a lot of instances to talk about the sort of values that you're supporting. And then you can trade off why those values matter. And we'll come on to that in a moment. The second sorts of arguments that we get, I think sometimes in democracy debates, and particularly around funding or how certain groups can access certain forms of democracy, is around coercion and around distortive effects of whether it's political funding or anything else, or the ability of parties to lie to the public, or the level of political education and things that might be required in different voting systems. For example, the Manchester Euros final, which I think was literally weighting votes versus how educated you were. I think I think that there are a few traps that people often fall into. The first is to say, aha, but this thing, whether it's donations, whether it's the ability of political parties to manipulate the truth, is coercive. And people often leave arguments about coercion at that. And it's always a little bit unclear why coercion matters, firstly. But secondly, and I think often the thing that gets missed out is coercion is there. Like, coercion is just sometimes there is an outside influence that affects your choice that you're making. And in all political campaigns, everyone is always trying to do that to an extent. And really drawing the line as to what coercion is acceptable or not is very difficult. And there's a lot of the time that I think teams try and just say this will increase coercion, and coercion is in and of itself bad. And the problem is that, firstly, sometimes it's not. That's part of the game of politics and democracy, and making your argument to people is that you're trying to persuade people, and persuasion is coercive to change their minds. But secondly, I think that often it's very difficult to sort of quantify what the change is in that level of coercion. I'll come on to the second thing that I have on funding in a second, but yeah, you have your hand up.
Um, I have a question, which is how do you fight left-wing bias in like that many judges in the debating community have? Because I feel like in many cases, there are left-wing outcomes or outcomes regarding coercion or anything like that that would just get weighed by judges much more than they should, even without explicit judge weighing by the teams.
Yeah. So I think it's quite useful to do a couple of things. The first thing I like to do, and this is actually something I'm going to come on to in a second. I'll do it now, talking about funding. So normally in debates about restricting the ability of political parties to get funding, you get lots of arguments, which is super rich people fund the right-wing parties, and that is bad. And we don't like that to happen. Normally because people don't like the super rich, or they don't like right-wing parties. But actually you can do, I think, a fairly compelling job by coming across very reasonably and saying, but this is the same in terms of how coercive it is, or how much these people might have an influence in politics, as unions funding left-wing parties. Those two things are the same. It's just they like unions, they don't like rich people. And I think if you actively give that trade-off to the panel and find that equivalence and just call it out as these things are the same, it's just that you feel a bit queasy about one, and a bit not about the other, it comes across as very reasonable. And I think that that's the most useful way that I find of advancing right-wing political arguments in my speeches, is just to be like, look, I'm not arguing for all of the crazy stuff that people think about when they think about right-wing political parties. I'm not saying kick out all the immigrants. I'm not saying no taxes for anybody. I'm not saying all of the worst things. I'm saying very reasonable stuff, which is it is politically unfair to disadvantage the right by saying they can't get donations, but allowing the left to also get donations. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, again, linking it back to how we design a good structure for governance. We presumably have some grounding principles on this, and I'll come on to some of those in a second, but everyone should be able to access democracy relatively equally. But also those parties that are choosing to represent you should have a level playing field. You shouldn't disadvantage one party for the benefit or to the disbenefit of other parties, for reasons purely of they are on the left rather than on the right. So if you're doing something in a debate that advantages the left, well, this could also be used by other parties to advantage the right. Like it does trade off, and it is quite symmetric. So I think there's only ever so much you can do to deal with any judge's hypothetical biases that they might have. You can't, unfortunately, deal with absolutely everything. But I think if you can, A, show that these things are often symmetric, and B, show that these things that you're arguing for are actually quite reasonable, I think that's probably the best way that I find of arguing for that. Does that make sense? Cool. I'll then come on to the common pitfalls that I tend to find in politics motions. And these are these are the sort of unnuanced things, and I think and a general lack of nuance that I think sometimes happens in these debates. This is almost always from top half teams that have panicked, seen, we're the Republican Party, or we're the Democratic Party, or we are a actor of some description, and thought, what are the stereotypical things that this particular actor is interested in? The SNP actually is another example. I think that there's a few things that that people forget about. Firstly, if we're talking about political parties, political parties are huge. Like there's hundreds of thousands of people within them, and even like within Congress or within any like parliament, there are tens, if not hundreds, of members of that party that have been elected. Like they're not all one thing, and they are all factions of different groups. Within that, and they're sort of united by a core value and a core purpose. But within the Republicans, you've got your MAGA Republicans. You've also got sort of your more boring center-right Republicans. Like, and if you think about, and maybe this is more people of my age than other ages, but like we'd have said that John McCain, when he ran against Obama in 2008, was a crazy right winger. We thought the same about Mitt Romney in 2012, and now we're sort of thinking to ourselves, actually, these guys are all right. These guys are pretty good. They're saying bad things about Trump, but they're still members of the Republican Party, I think, and they're still definitely in the case of Romney, and they're still sort of active within it. And the party, as with any other movement, has a wide diversity of interests, and it's not always short-termist, and it's not always we want to win. They face lots of different trade-offs because different scales of losses, as the Conservative Party in the UK may be about to find out in 24 hours time, in 48 hours time, can mean different things. It can mean those factions can drift apart from each other, and that party can't exist anymore, or struggles to exist anymore, struggles to be successful in the long term when it has new leadership and new people moving it forward. So I think focusing on actors only caring about winning elections is something a lot of teams do, something that's very natural for teams to do, particularly when you're panicking and trying to work out what the interests of an actor are. It's not always accurate, and it is always worth taking a couple of minutes to think about, okay, but these actors don't just have one interest, they have like two or three at least. And how can we push a little bit on a nuanced range of interests that they might have? The second thing, and this is when we think about the actors of voters, and I'm saying actors here not as in this house as a X, but actors as in people who operate within a debate who we care about, stakeholders really. Is we often have debates about whether left-wing parties should move slightly more left or slightly more centrist, and whether right-wing parties should move slightly more right or slightly more centrist. And we almost always hear arguments, which is if you're on the left, you're not going to win any more votes by going left. All of the votes are in the center, whatever the center means. And this rush to the median, I think, really forgets how individual voters actually work, which is there's no, like, you can't line every single person up and be like, this is the most left wing person to the most right wing person, and then be like, you in the middle, you are the centrist. Like, everybody has views on different topics that are slightly more left wing or slightly more right wing. And you can hold left wing views and right wing views and centrist views. You can hold massive capitalist views on the one hand, socially progressive views on the other hand, but also think some things that might be aligned with, workers being allowed to have rights and having access to some sort of means of production. Like, you can hold all of those things on different topics simultaneously. I think we try to think that voters are conservative, therefore they believe all of the things the Conservatives believe. Whereas actually, if you're the Labour Party, that's a centre-left party in the UK, and you take a specific right-wing stance, that might actually win you a lot of votes. Okay, you are moving to the right, but it might be that that specific stance is very useful. Or you might want to take a specific left-wing stance because actually people believe that some stuff should be nationalized that isn't currently nationalized. And if you take those, and I think if you're thinking about what those specific stances are and why those stances are, and this is the important word, determinative to people's votes, i.e., this is going to change how they vote. It's not just going to be an issue net they're going to broadly move across. You can start to really understand that voter base a little bit more. That's all I wanted to say on common pitfalls in these debates. I don't know if anyone has particular, oh, there's a question in the chat. Please, could you give an example of what you would say is a stronger argument for democracy, which is better than outcomes like you described, i.e. economic benefit or decreased conflict? I might have missed the example you gave. What do you believe the strongest case would be? Okay, so let's say you are in a hypothetical debate that is one of the ones we discussed earlier. This house prefers to be ruled by a benevolent dictator than a democracy, and I'm pro-democracy side, let's say, on this, and broadly speaking I am, except for when people do things I don't like. So let's say somebody has said that or actually, no, I'm benevolent dictator, and somebody has made the argument on democracy that democracies allow you to access people's interests, which means you get to better understand how they operate in the economy, so you can make better economic policies. And democracies are good because that better economic policy means that people will be more prosperous because GDP will grow, everything will work, blah 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 blah. I think there's lots of reasons to believe that you can also have better economic policies as a dictator, and that sometimes democracies aren't very effective at doing those things. That sometimes democracies have to cater to everybody's, or to a group of people, because different groups of people's interests are directly oppositional to each other. So you have people who want higher taxes for businesses, people who want lower taxes, people who want more welfare spending, people who want less state spending overall, and that you have to try and aggregate and pull against some of these things. Whereas actually, if you have one person making a decision, you can sort of make more efficient policies, and that might be in a number of economic instances better. So if I was then the closing team on team democracy, the better argument, I think, and I think this is what the question is getting at, is I think to be like, doesn't matter about whether this leads to a certain outcome or not, because the point of these outcomes, or sort of whether or not you get these outcomes, is so dependent on who is in charge and what their interests are. In a democracy, it's about, in all of these trade-offs, which side generally do you fall down on? In a benevolent dictator, it's also the same, right? It's, does your dictator happen to be somebody that gives you the things that you want, or somebody that doesn't? So the important thing is that you have an ability to inform whoever that leader is about what policy would be beneficial for you. And if you can inform them about what policy can be beneficial for you, they can take decisions that lead to better economic growth. If everyone can do it, you can get to a position where they can take more informed decisions about what might lead to better economic growth. And the thing that you're then doing is you're providing the base reason, which is everyone has access to be, or everyone has the ability to express their preferences. All of the politicians then have access to what your preferences are because of how you voted. And that enables them to do the economic stuff or do a lot of those outcomes. So the most important thing isn't what the outcome is, but giving them the means to make those decisions in the most informed possible way by aggregating your preferences successfully. And that's something that I'm going to come on to in the next couple of slides, but David has his hand up.
Just in terms of this idea of aggregating preferences, why can democracies only do it? So why can a dictatorship do polling or surveys or other sort of means? And what's the difference there that's important?
Yeah. So I think they can do all of those things. There's no argument as to why they can't do all of those things. And they could do it and they could mandate it because they're a dictatorship. So that would be a very strong response. I don't know why they would do that, because I think there are presumably one of two things happens. Either the dictator does poll on poll on economic policies, and people vote on what that economic policy is. At which point, there's a bit of a question as to whether this becomes a dictatorship, but they have two choices at the end of that. Either they always do what the public want, but the public will want a broad range of options. So I'm not entirely sure whether they will have all of the ability to make a decision in as informed a way. But secondly, the decision they're going to pick might not sort of balance out all of those, and they have a very different sort of set of interests as to how they balance out those. Dictators may choose to preference people based on whether or not going against them will lead to them being overthrown, because they don't want to go against the army because the army are people that can overthrow them, whereas like other people can't overthrow them as easily. So they appease certain groups consistently, whereas in democracies, often you try to appease certain groups sort of broadly averagely, particularly if you've just won, you kind of want to keep voters in that same sort of space so that you can continue winning in the future. So your ability to then like average out, or your desire to then average out those sort of outcomes is probably slightly better. Or secondly, you take all of these views and then you just go against them anyway if you're a dictator, but then there's no ability for people to then do anything about it, or a limited ability for people to do anything about it. So I think the question then, yes, they can access preferences, but what do they do off of the back of them? And is there any situation where a democracy might be better, or sorry, it might be worse than that? It would then be the debate. I think it's a useful one to fall into, flowing from that. But that would sort of be the response that I would look to provide to that. Wendy has asked, to follow up with a centre-left party may take a specific right-leaning stance. Is there a specific real-life example on how it changed election results in any Western liberal democracy, or perhaps a debate recording where people won the room with this characterization? So I could not be the worst person to ask about debate recordings because I almost never watch them. If anyone does have one, please do pop that in the chat for Wendy to help as well. In terms of sort of the specific example, I actually think that a lot of the current, and I will chat about this a bit when I talk about UK politics, I think there's a lot of the stuff that the current Labour Party in the UK is doing and taking right-leaning stances, particularly economically, saying that it's not going to increase taxes, saying that it's going to live within very tight fiscal rules, specifically so that it looks economically competent in comparison to what we currently have had for the past few years. And all of those rules that they're talking about are basically the rules that the initial Conservative government in 2010, or the Conservative Lib Dem coalition in 2010, imposed as part of the austerity packages after the 2008 financial crash. And it's doing that to look respectable and look electable, because it's had a long period of Jeremy Corbyn, who was maybe a bit economically very liberal. So I think they're actively overshifting to the right in order to show that there's a very clear distinction from the past. So I think that would be one example that I would use, that I think will have changed an election result in a couple of days' time if the polls are to be believed. But yeah, fab. I will move on to the strategies section, which I think some of these questions are starting to touch on, which either says to me that I've structured this really well because it naturally flows, or really badly because I've been leaving these questions open and not answering them. We'll find out which. So good strategies for democracy debates. So I've talked a bit about preference aggregation already, but there are basically three things or three clashes that almost always come up in any debate about democracies, in particular ones about voting and process reforms, but also about sort of the more theological questions about democracies. One is about how do you best represent people? Two is about how can you hold the people you elect accountable? And three is about how do you best aggregate people's preferences and who has the best ability to do that. I'll touch on the first two quickly because I think they're a bit more intuitive. But on representation, does the system allow for good representation? What is represent? I mean, what are any of these words? I kind of feel like this with all debates. So what do the words mean? But like representation, what is good representation? Does the system allow you to be represented in the best way? And what groups are being represented? So I think one of the earlier debates was that this House would only allow women to vote on issues around abortion. Like maybe they're the only group that matter. So maybe they're the only ones whose representation actually matters within that particular context. Maybe they're not. That's the debate. But that also forms part of the discussion. Similarly, if you have any debate about giving additional votes to different groups of people. But also like who can like truly represent you. I think often we have lots of discussions about the political class being out of touch and rich and these annoying elites. It's like, but they can still represent people. They still or can they still represent people? Just because they don't understand like my story, does that mean that they can't accurately represent the policies and that I would like to vote for? The second thing is about accountability. So if people do a bad job, can we get rid of them? I think, for what it's worth, this is one of the few excellent arguments for the first past the post system, where you can vote out a leader directly in their constituency in the UK or in other countries, in other systems, in other sort of regions. Whereas lots of proportional representation means that the people who are often at the top of the party tend to be at the top of the list, and they'll always get enough votes for them. And the people who are actually held to account are your sort of average members of parliament or your average members of Congress, rather than sort of a very specific individual that you can hold to account. There's also a good question about like what sort of outcomes does accountability tend to drive when people are scared about losing their seats. Who do they run to? What sort of policies do they push for? Is accountability always a good thing? And these two things often become quite a bit of a discussion point in any democracy debates around representation and accountability. Because I think we generally believe when we're setting up a democratic structure, people should be allowed to vote equally, more or less, or maybe proportionally to how much it matters to them. And they should be represented. But also, if people aren't representing them, they should be, because of the importance of that job, they should be able to be replaced and held to account. Now, sometimes, particularly if you're extending off of a team, your opening might have talked about responsibility, your second half might have talked about accountability. And you in the whip speech may then be tasked with thinking a little bit about why one of those is more important than the other. I would just recommend that people take a couple of minutes, and I'm happy if we have time at the end to also chat about some thoughts on this, to think of almost like some stock weighing that you can do between these three things as to what is the most important thing within any given debate. why is it that accountability might sometimes be more important than representation? I think you can explain quite well, I'll do this bit now, why accountability actually drives representation, that when people are scared of being voted out, they move more in line with the interests of the voters in order to get them themselves sort of elected, and that gives you that representative power. You might argue that representation is more important than accountability because that's about delivering on the things that you have done, and that accountability can only happen after the fact, like after you already haven't delivered on something and you failed people, then we deal with it. Whereas actually we should think about how we can force people or create a better environment for people to deliver on the promises and the hopes and aspirations of others. And this necessarily seems a bit chicken and egg, because sometimes you might want to weigh A over B and sometimes you might want to weigh B over A, and there isn't actually an answer as to which is more important. But you might want to just think about different ways in which you can weigh those two things, because there almost always clashes around this that can explain why one of these might be the most important thing within a round. The last thing, and I've sort of touched on it, is about preference aggregation. My personal view, and if anyone's been in a debate with me recently, you've probably heard a lot about me talking about how people can access their preferences and why aggregation of these is really, really important, because I quite like crowbarring democracy things into any other debate. I think, firstly, it's always really important to think about how can elected officials access an understanding of people's preferences. We get lots of debates about political polling in a major election year. These things tend to come up at various different competitions. These polls tend to be a really, really good way of political parties understanding, do people like this particular policy platform, or do people not like this particular policy platform? I think the ways in which that people can access an understanding of people's preferences, and acknowledging, as David said earlier, different systems also exist where people can still access that, but the question of the mechanisms to do so is something to think about. The second thing is sort of a bit of the weighing that I've just done to some extent, but do preferences drive policies or vice versa? So if everybody in the country, there are lots of issues actually on this, where the people, generally speaking, are more I don't know, to the left of a party or to the right of a party, but the party doesn't generally represent people in the same way. So if everybody tomorrow woke up and was like, we should ban cars, I don't think that the government would, or any government would be like, okay, so we're going to ban cars, right? So it's not always the case that people's preferences drive what those policies are. And sometimes the political framing of different policies can drive people's preferences. So a very effective example will be, in many people's minds, the Brexit campaign within the UK, where a lot of very unfortunate, but very, in my opinion, very clever framing was done by the Brexit campaign to sort of have the political policies and things that they're pushing driving people's preferences, and the political messaging driving their preferences, rather than political parties being responsive to people's preferences. And this is a very good way, I think, if teams talk to you about being able to aggregate people's preferences and you're opposing this, of sort of undermining some of that. Like, people's preferences aren't necessarily their actual preference, but sort of what they've been lobbied into believing. And then the last thing, and this is a thing that comes up quite a lot, particularly in debates about sort of personality politics or any other thing, is what is a legitimate preference for somebody to express? If I think Donald Trump is just a really good golfer, therefore I think he's the best person to run America, is that a legitimate reason to vote for him? I mean, I think probably most people would say that's not a legitimate reason to vote for him. So should I be stopped from voting for him for that reason? Is a question that is often at the core of, like, what information do we provide voters with? Any debate about blind voting or these sort of votes for policies kinds of debates. Is it reasonable for me to express a preference for somebody based on the personality of them? All of these questions are just things that I think are useful to think about. I personally take quite an open view that literally anything is a fair preference. I think that often the most important things that come up during somebody's presidency or somebody's prime ministership are things that are very unpredictable, and we're going to rely on their character a lot. to have to contend with, and that's why a lot of that character can be useful. But yeah, there are lots of different views on that. David.
What's the difference between representation and preference aggregation? Like, how can someone represent you without knowing your preferences, or like vice versa? If that makes sense.
Yeah. So they are very similar. I would say representation is an individual thing, and preference aggregation is a group thing, generally speaking. So representation is, does this person do broadly what I or other people would like them to do? Preference aggregation, to a certain extent, is lots of people would like you to do lots of conflicting and competing things. Do you understand roughly how many people want that, how important that is to them, and have the ability to make an informed decision about what would be best for those people? So it is part of representation because you represent a group, but it's also about, but then representation sort of from the individual's perspective is much more, is this person sort of solving things for me? Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Cool, no worries. Any other questions on this? Excellent. In which case, could you explain how to apply these strategies in debates? E.g., this House supports independents running for election, or this House, as a Liberal in the US, would spoil their votes. So these two things, I think, are more about, and this is a bit of a facetious definition, but more about politics debates than democracy debates. I will do the politics ones, and then I will come to your question, Shrishti, which I do think will fit into some of these things. So, strategies for political debates, and this feeds into some of what I said earlier. Firstly, I think we should think very hard about what the various different political incentives for people are, what issues are important for them, who has a say in the party and how it stands, and what the party stands for, and as sort of mentioned earlier, being aware of the different sub-factions and being aware of sort of the fact that there might be multiple different interests, and sometimes those interests might conflict and they might think about things differently. And then secondly, really embracing nuance about the groups that we're talking about, which feeds into some of this as well. But why might parties care about their policy platform over short-term interests, particularly if we're talking about fundamental shifts in policy platform, like the Labour Party shifting to the right on economic issues? That's not a very Labour position. So they've changed their policy platform in order to cater to short-term interests. Sometimes they might not want to do that. Sometimes they might say, actually, it's more important to us to stick to a principle. Joe Biden actually always used to talk about, in the run-up to the 2020 election, what are you wanting to, what's worth losing over? If you wake up and you lose, what would make you think, okay, it was right that I lost. I didn't want to do or concede ground on this thing. What is that principle? Similarly, why might a leader care about their legacy over smaller achievements? And then talking a little bit about sub-factions as well. The last thing on politics debates, and this happens quite a lot, and this is fairly similar in terms of sort of the outcome stuff that I was talking later, is to really try to ignore things that are contingent on external factors as much as possible. So politics always has a number of different actors who always act in lots of slightly unpredictable ways, which means that, for example, if you're on a motion about getting rid of the electoral college, if you're on a motion about whether or not you should the Democratic Party should replace Joe Biden, or whether Joe Biden should stand down, like it actually, we'll take that one. So this House believes this House as Joe Biden would stand down. You may argue that this will make it more likely that Trump loses if you stand down. There are so many reasons as to why that's not going to happen either way, because all of the things that are required to happen to win the election for the Democratic Party, there are so many different factors that feed into that. So it's not just going to be any one thing, and you're going to make yourself contingent on an awful lot of like preconditions and sub-events that may not happen. So really, really try and be as uncontingent on stuff as you might possibly want to be. And then just to flag, there is an extent to which parties take long-term stances, even if they're short-term unpopular. So this feeds into the question from Shrishti about applying these strategies in debates. I will take, I'm happy to take either of these actually. I will take this House supports independents running for elections, um, because I think the really interesting thing about independents is, I mean, this is true also about liberals in the US, but for both of these, it's the embrace nuance point. You get different kinds of independence. So why is this person independent, or why are these people independents? You have a group of independents who, well, none of these people really care that much about the Democratic or the Republican parties, or whichever system we're talking about, any of those things. So why do we support them running, even if they don't? Well, they might have a very specific or a very particular view on the world that is just useful for us to have. The reasons that they might have for not wanting to be part of those parties is to give them greater control and emphasis over what those issues are. So the reason, if you're arguing for a particular policy that may align with a different political party, but you might be an independent, you might be outside of that party, is because you want to be in control of that being the most important thing to you, rather than being part of a party machine, which may trade off the emphasis on your policy versus the emphasis on any one of a number of different policies. Secondly, a lot of people are independents because the things they want to run on matter a lot to their local area, but not to the whole nation, or not to, or they don't want to be tarred with the negative things of a major national party. So they might think that this really, really, really important local issue, or this really, really important thing for their constituency or for their town or for their state, is something that they need to push, and that's why they're an independent. So we'd support them running in that instance because of the reasons as to why it is they are an independent. So that would be the sort of thing that I would try and look for, is all of the different reasons as to why somebody might be part of this quite broad group of people. And then I think there's also lots of stuff about how parties react to that. Different groups will react differently to different independents. So you'll have some people who will sort of try and welcome independents into the party and act fairly collegiately with them. You will see that these independents can often be quite good at bridging the gaps between different political parties and working bipartisanly, and in lots of instances that's very good. But you will also then, and I do think it's worth thinking about that, even if they're not this helpful bipartisan person in terms of embracing nuance and looking at their political incentives, they might be people who are on the extremes, and we support them running because those are still voices that need to be heard, and they still need to be quantified as to how much people value them, and particularly in systems and democratic systems, if we want to talk about sort of the democratic stuff rather than the politics stuff. They might represent a very niche group of people who deserve to have some level of representation, deserve to be able to express their views or have their preferences heard. And it might be that the major parties don't allow them to do that because this person is running on a particular stance or a particular platform. This might be that you have like really strong animal rights views and you want to run on that, and people who really feel strongly about animal rights views might also want to vote for you. And that option is good, and we should give people that option. And if you don't win, you don't win. So you don't get to represent absolutely everything, but you do give a voice and lend a voice to that. So those would be if I was approaching that from the politics side or from the democracy side, the sort of two ways that I would look to go about it, which I hope helps. That is everything I wanted to say on those motions before I do a quick canter through the dumpster fire of UK politics. Is there anything else that people want me to pick up quickly before I do? If not, you can also feel free to message me, ideally on Facebook, because I respond to that.
One quick question.
Yeah.
How do you believe it's the best way to just giving people a voice, giving people a platform, how to weigh that against other potential arguments?
Excellent question. And this nicely leads into, in some ways, some of the UK politics stuff, particularly UK politics since 2016. When you don't give people a voice, that doesn't mean that person can't vote. That doesn't mean that person isn't incentivized to still think about and campaign for those things. That means there's still going to be a group of those people who believe that thing, and Brexit is a very good example of this, where major political parties aren't talking to them. And that means that somebody else can do, and that other person may be more dangerous. In a less abstract version of this, pre-2016, the United Kingdom had not had a massive discussion about an uptick in net migration, and people who expressed concerns about that badly were often marginalized and sidelines from those debates. And I think that meant that we ended up in a position where the only people who were talking to them about the thing that they cared about were far-right people and Cambridge Analytica and lots of data mining companies that were then able to massively do probably illegal things and swing the vote. So the way that I would say that it's really important to give people a voice is when you give them a voice and allow them to be represented, it allows parties to engage with them. And when you ignore the things that they're talking about, and you ignore those things and they don't feel engaged with the process, political parties don't then have an incentive to engage with them. They're quite happy for you to sit at home and not vote. The problem is that then there can be a one issue party that comes up and really whips up a level of, in that case, hatred amongst sort of anti-immigration people. But in other instances, it might just be really taking you to the extreme of whatever that movement is. That might be weird animal rights stuff, and then you join weird animal rights groups. That might be the communist parties that exist across Europe. Those sorts of things, those people then end up being the people that you then talk to. So that's how I would weigh that. Does that help, Hannah?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. Sweet. I will then do a very quick canter through for the last 15 minutes of UK politics. Again, feel free to raise your hand up or whatever else to grab my attention if there are things that you think are unexplained or you would like a bit more information on. So very quick hits on how our electoral system works. Obviously, we have a king now. He is the head of the state. He is also the head of the Church of England, which is the state religion. He doesn't do very much. We will come on to norms and things later, but whilst he signs off on every piece of legislation or primary legislation in Parliament, he doesn't actually have much of a say. He has a parliament which has two chambers. It has the House of Commons, which is the elected MPs and where they sit. He did also do adultery, which is the House of Commons and where the elected MPs sit, and you have the House of Lords, which is sort of the unelected chamber where people are appointed politically and by the leaders of political parties. There are less what used to be called hereditary members of the House of Lords than there used to be. So it used to be the case that, like, if your dad was a member of the House of Lords, you got to be a member of the House of Lords when he died. There's no longer the case for most of the people in the House of Lords. There are 650 constituencies, and they all elect a member of Parliament. We have a first past the post system, which leads to some bizarre electoral outcomes that we'll come on to in a minute. Party leaders are, broadly speaking, elected by the members of those political parties. So Labour members voted for Keir Starmer to become the leader of the Labour Party. The exception for this is Reform UK, which is Nigel Farage and Richard Tice's party. They are technically a business rather than they are enrolled as a business, and the people who hold shares in that business get to appoint the party leaders. There is, in different parties, some filtering of who can stand by the members of Parliament and things beforehand, or the unions that help decide that, but that's broadly how it works. The Prime Minister is the leader of the largest party in the House of Commons, that is currently Rishi Sunak. And the cabinet, so people like the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, the Transport Secretary for my job, and people who look at all of the different parts of the country are all appointed by the Prime Minister. Almost all of them are elected MPs. Some of them are members of the House of Lords. Currently, most notably for the next few days, David Cameron, who used to be the Prime Minister, was made a member of the House of Lords and is now the Foreign Secretary, which is unusual But generally speaking, the people who are also in charge of all of the government departments are people who are elected at a general election, which is happening on Thursday. This is what on here is the UK electoral landscape for what I am going to say is the last 4 major elections. So the thing that's worth considering just at the start of this is our constituencies are weighted by population size. So the Labour Party, which picks up a lot of votes in sort of major towns and cities and urban areas, has a lot of geographically smaller constituencies. So on the left-hand side, whilst most of the country is blue, for the Conservatives, this was the last Labour majority under Tony Blair in 2005, and it was a very, very large majority. This second graph is in 2010, where the Conservative Party, who have ruled since then, were in coalition with the Liberal Democrats after the 2008 crash. The third graph is the state of play after the last general election in 2019. One notable thing, and if you were listening to Bethany's podcast, these could be podcasts now, on Scotland yesterday evening, you'll notice that there's a big bump in the very light yellow for the SNP, which is expected to sort of shrink a bit over the next week. And this on the right-hand side is the current polling expectations for Thursday night when our election comes to a close. Maybe a dumb question, but in the case that you have a coalition in the parliament, but none of the coalition parties are the largest party in the House, does the Prime Minister still come from the largest party? This is not a dumb question. This is a good question. In that instance, the Prime Minister, those parties in the coalition, so the Prime Minister is technically the person who can command a majority in the House. So the Prime Minister would be decided by the parties in the coalition as to who that would be. In theory, that has never happened in the United Kingdom. We tend not to have coalitions because of the electoral system, but the parties would come to an agreement. So in 2010, when we had the Liberal Democrat and Conservative coalition, they came to a formalised, I think, contractual agreement as to how many members of cabinet and things each party would have, and the rest of it. Part of that agrees that in that instance, David Cameron remained the Prime Minister as the leader of the larger party of the coalition, but they would agree between themselves in that particular instance. The main 4 UK political parties at the minute, and I'm using these as the UK political parties because these are the 4 parties that stand across Great Britain. Northern Ireland is slightly different, and I will mention the parties in the other countries momentarily. So you have Rishi Sunak, who is the head of the Conservative and Unionist Party. Sir Keir Starmer, head of the Labour Party, likely to be the next Prime Minister. Sir Ed Davey, who is the head of the Liberal Democrats Party, which is a very sort of centrist party, very socially left-wing, conservative, a bit more economically conservative. They often go with a tagline of, we're trying to put a heart into the Conservatives and a brain into the Labour Party. And then you have Nigel Farage's Reform Party, which is standing across Great Britain. Not pictured here are the following parties. So the Scottish National Party, again, see yesterday's session. Plaid Cymru, who are the Welsh nationalists who stand in the Welsh constituencies. I've not pictured the Green Party. Technically, they have lots of different parties. There's the Green Party of England and Wales, the Scottish Greens, and they currently have 1 member of Parliament, Caroline Lucas, who is standing down. And then a number of parties in Northern Ireland, which has a slightly different agreement in terms of which parties, which of the main UK parties will stand there. But the major parties, the sort of 2 most significant parties for people to broadly be aware of, are the DUP, who are the sort of UK Unionist Party, and Sinn Féin, who are the Irish Unionist Party and would look to have a more united Ireland, and they both live in a power sharing agreement in the Northern Irish Assembly, but also in the case of the DUP, they send members of Parliament to Westminster, Sinn Féin do not send members of parliament to Westminster. They have members of parliament who are elected. They choose to not take up their seats because part of the ritual of becoming a member of parliament is that you sort of give yourself over to the monarch, and Sinn Féin have some fairly deep ideological views around that mean that they choose not to take up their seat. There are a few narratives ahead of the election that will be probably quite useful to just be aware of, particularly if you get motions about the UK, particularly with EUDC being hosted in the UK. The first is Labour have surged quite significantly and the Conservative Party have completely imploded. There is a lot of anti-Tory voting after about 14 years and 5 prime ministers, 3 of whom were actually elected to do anything. Tories tend to get in when people think we just need somebody to relatively competently manage the economy. One of the reasons they're losing is because they've not relatively competently managed the economy, and people also don't like them. Labour have taken a general view of saying that the Conservatives are very much like, vote for us again. We need stability at this period of time. And Labour's line in this election is that stability is actually change, because what we currently have is massive levels of instability. Most people are not particularly excited about the prospect of Keir Starmer. He's not very interesting. He's made a thing of not being interesting because we've had some very interesting prime ministers and they've all been pretty terrible. And if he wins a majority, it will be the lowest point following the 2019 election with Jeremy Corbyn that anybody has ever won a majority from. It'll be like the greatest political comeback in UK political history for a party. It may be the largest ever majority in UK, or definitely in post-war UK politics. The second sort of narrative that is quite interesting and is getting a bit of traction is about who's going to likely come in third place, either with votes or with seats, between the Liberal Democrats and Reform. Reform being sort of the very hard right, old, they're newly branded after being the Brexit Party. They are likely to get similar numbers of votes, but the Lib Dems in current polling are likely to get about 20 or 30 times as many seats as Reform are likely to. This is partly because of our really dumb electoral system, which massively encourages people or encourages parties to target very, very well. And the Liberal Democrats are very good at targeting. So the Liberal Democrats on these maps are this darker yellowy gold colour. And you can see that there are specific areas, particularly in the southwest of England, where they tend to do quite well, and as well in parts of Scotland. They tend to do reasonably well in sort of their sort of middle England target areas where people feel a bit uncomfortable about some of the harder lines of the Conservative Party, but also don't feel like they're willing to give themselves over to a left-wing Labour Party. I've said the banter outcome of the Lib Dems coming in second and beating the Conservatives is also possible on a really bad night for the Conservatives. Because what Reform are doing, by contrast to the Lib Dems, is heavily splitting the Conservative vote everywhere, rather than actually being very, very focused in a number of constituencies. So it's likely that Reform will probably come in second or third in a huge number of constituencies, and as a result win almost 0 constituencies, whereas the Liberal Democrats are much more likely to win about 60 or 70. There's been some news about Reform. The Reform are finding out the hard way what the SNP found out when they exploded about 15 years ago, which is that if you're a massively growing political party and you're putting people up for election, you really need to vet them very, very well. They recently spent a bunch of money on a vetting company that didn't do a very good job, and are finding out, perhaps unsurprisingly, that a lot of their candidates are secretly incredibly racist. And they massively screwed up on their vetting. And the last thing that comes from this, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, why on earth, if the Liberal Democrats and the Reform Party are likely to get similar amounts of votes, the Lib Dems going to get a load more seats? It's because that both of these parties campaign fairly heavily as well for electoral reform, and that is likely to be it's not because of that. That is an outcome of this, and that will likely be a hot topic again. I did just want to touch on the SNP. They are likely to lose a lot of seats following a lot of the issues with regards to their financial situation. The one thing just to note in Scotland is there are almost zero. There are very, very few sort of swing seats between the Conservatives and the Labour Party. There are lots of swing seats between the Conservatives and the SNP, between Labour and the SNP, and a few between the Liberal Democrats and the SNP. But a lot of that those swings move on the sort of two axes that Bethany talked about yesterday in her session on Scotland. The SNP like to claim that if they win half of the seats, that's a mandate for a new independence referendum, but they've been claiming that for every election forever, and it's not happened. Just wanted to quickly look at the polling data, which over the last few years, one of the things you will notice is that during the time that Boris Johnson was in charge, so in 2020 and 2021, the Conservatives were polling broadly reasonably well. Although that gap narrowed quite considerably when Labour decided to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn and have somebody with a brain in power instead. And this sort of, I guess, crossover occurred at the instance of Partygate, which was when the Conservative Party and the government were found to be having parties and wine and cheese things in government buildings during the pandemic. People who had gone through the pandemic, through lockdown, were not very happy for very understandable reasons, and that massively lost a lot of confidence. The gap between the Labour and the Conservative Party then widened in an amazing 6-week period where Liz Truss became the Prime Minister. She massively bailed out everybody's energy bills and then said that she was going to give a huge tax cut to the country, and all of the economic markets said, you can do one of these two things, but otherwise you can't afford to do it. In doing so, this massively destroyed economic confidence in the UK, massively increased inflation, and interest rates made everybody's mortgage, if you're a homeowner, significantly more expensive within a 6-week period when there was already a cost of living pressure. And she lasted famously less long than it took a lettuce so somebody had a picture of her in a lettuce, and whether the lettuce would outlast her. Since then, things have been fairly stable. Rishi Sunak has not been able to move the polls. Labour have dipped a bit, and the Conservatives have dipped a bit recently, partly with the rise of reform, but also a lot of tactical voting, where in some seats Labour are sort of stopping campaigning so that other people could beat the Conservatives. I just want to chat, there's two final slides that I have to chat through super quickly. One is on sort of structural things about UK politics. The word that you might see quite a bit is devolution, and there's two forms of devolution. One, we have devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, where we grant those countries some level of self-governance on certain defined policy issues like education or transport or some local health services. These issues tend to be largely local things rather than things like defence or trade, which tend to be reserved to the UK government. We also devolve things to cities, and that has been increasing over the last few years. The UK has one of the most centralised governments in the West, and we have increasingly started to give powers to different cities, but a lot of that tends to be on fairly marginal grounds. Mayors of sort of metropolitan areas and cities are aligned to political parties, but they are noticeably less sort of party political and tribal, and much more about just doing sensible management, good things for their area. The last thing just on structural issues in UK politics is that we operate a lot on norms. We don't have a written codified constitution in the way that sort of most other functioning countries would. We're very heavily precedent based around ideals and around norms, and the weaknesses of this have been exposed in recent years as there's very little defined punishment for breaking them. For example, if you're a prime minister and you break the law, there's no like, you can't then be prime minister. Similarly, when it comes to things like Scottish independence, there was a big question as to whether or not the Scottish government could unilaterally just say, we want to have a referendum on this. There's nothing to, it went to the Supreme Court to make a judgment on this, but there's not a constitution that says, here's how people can secede. Lastly, just on what the top 3 policy issues are in the UK at the minute. One of these is around our health service. We have an aging population living longer, and we have an NHS that is free at the point of use, paid by national insurance, which is a very specific kind of tax, and other general taxes. It is increasingly under-resourced, but the truth is, because we've got quite an aging population, it's also very overused compared to how it has been in previous years. It is seen as, I think the phrase is a golden cow, which is that nobody really wants to touch it or say that there is anything wrong with it. It's really the holy grail of like UK politics in some ways. And we all want to say that everything about it is perfect. There are some parties that are starting to think about having some sort of insurance top-up system like most of Europe, but that is sort of the question of how much we can continue to fund that is really, really pressing. There's obviously the migration question, which has gotten significantly worse post-Brexit, moderately ironically. So in 2010, the Conservative Party pledged to cut migration to the tens of thousands from about 150,000 a year in terms of net migration. Last year, it was 685,000, so that's going very well. And the two particular issues that have been topical recently in the UK on migration is one, the small boats sort of crisis of people people seeking refuge in the UK via the Channel crossing from France on small boats, normally by people traffickers. And the government response to this, which has so far been to agree a deal with Rwanda where we can send people to Rwanda for processing for those claims of asylum. This is something the Labour Party have said that they're not going to continue doing, but there is a broader question, I think, about what does happen. There are moves from the Labour Party that they want to work more closely with the French, but that may or may not occur. The last thing is just on our economy. So obviously, like much of the world, we've had some COVID and Russia. Russia's war in Ukraine has increased a lot of pressure on the cost of living. Brexit specifically has not helped in this. We now have the highest tax burden that we have had in history after 14 years of Conservative government, which is fairly unusual, in large part after Liz Truss. Inflation following Liz Truss has now started to fall to tolerable levels, but there, as mentioned in response to a question earlier, the austerity agenda post 2010 and the really tough financial rules that has enforced on the UK is largely not being debated, and Labour have accepted that a lot of those need to continue. So there are huge economic questions about how we continue to fund fairly creaking services with very little infrastructure, particularly around housing and transport, as we move forward. Sorry, that was a bit quick at the end. I would just answer the last couple of pieces in the chat, unless anybody else has anything before handing over to Ilya. So, Piotr, how does the Supreme Court then decide on large issues? Ziad said vibes and precedents. Honestly, like kind of a little bit. So the Supreme Court will decide whether there is precedents and things that have happened beforehand that this would be massively contravening, and we have an incredibly large what they call statute book, which I don't think is a literal book, but it's just all of the laws and things that we have within the country, because our sort of legislative system is a bit stupid. So there's an awful lot of working through precedent, but also making sure that the things don't contravene odd clauses in very specific bills that have previously been passed. In particular on independence, when the Scottish government, they used like the precedent of the 2014 independence referendum to understand whether the Scottish government could call on that vote. In terms of Saskia's questions, do I have any suggestions for good resource that outlined nuanced arguments for and against a common law system? I do not, because I don't know law, but I will ask a couple of people, Saskia, and put something in the Discord if I get anything back on this. I have found that whenever I've needed to think about this for either motions or stuff, I just do the light touch Google and see what pops up. I'm sure that there will have been some stuff previously mentioned in various debating for about this, but I will ask some of the legal debaters for some good pointers. And Fernanda says, if Keir Starmer is so unremarkable, why is he the Labour candidate? And what's there to argue for him, if anything? This is the question at the core of the election currently. One of the things that is very advantageous about that is in the last election we had to choose between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, who are very definitely remarkable figures. You could remark on them a lot, but neither of them were particularly what the country wanted. And I think a lot of the country is very tired of having very larger than life affable characters that are really pressing for fairly extreme things and just want somebody. And Starmer's made a big point of trying to make politics tread more lightly on people's lives. So there's a lot of just, I guess, fatigue, and people just want someone who's going to boringly take things on and deal with things in a very boring way. In terms of what is there to argue for him, his campaign has mostly been focused on the Tories have been bad for 14 years, and this has been the main thing to use to beat him over the head in response. I think that it's got to a point with the Conservative Party and the management of the last 14 years where people just aren't listening to whether or not he has particularly new ideas, but people have fallen so out of trust with the Conservative Party that sort of anything will be probably a bit better than this. That, and he comes across fundamentally reasonably decent and in touch, whereas Rishi Sunak has managed to do just about everything possible in this campaign to make him look as out of touch and useless as possible. Right. Those, I think, the answers to everything. I'm really sorry, Ilya, for running slightly over, though we did also start slightly late. But I shall hand over now. If you do have any other questions, do just reach out to me. As I say, ideally over Facebook, because I check that more than I check Discord. And I will catch you all at something soon.